In this story, we read of two problems Jesus can heal and two very different responses. The first, physical blindness, is obvious. The other, spiritual blindness, is much easier to overlook then and now. So let's have a look at the story. Unlike many of Jesus' miracles, this man who had been born blind did not ask Jesus for help. And in verse 11, when asked who healed him, he said, the man they called Jesus, suggesting that he hadn't got any interest in or particular knowledge about Jesus before he was healed. It was the disciples that drew Jesus' attention to the man, asking, who sinned, this man or his parents? That's an odd question to us. So why did they ask it? Some Jews in Jesus' time believed that all illness and disability was the result of somebody's wrongdoing. And some bright sparks had mixed this with Greek philosophy and concluded that babies could do something wrong before they were born. And the disciples had obviously been influenced by this thinking to ask the question. Jesus' response is very definite. Verse 11 in the Message says, you're asking the wrong questions. You're looking for someone to blame. There is no cause and effect here. Look instead for what God can do. A totally different way of looking at life's problems. I'm going to call the blind man Luke, though the Bible doesn't give him a name, rather than saying the blind man all the time. So Jesus used spit and dust to make a mud paste and put it over Luke's eyes, and then told him to go to the pool of Siloam to wash it off. And whenever I read this story, I thought using spit was a bit disgusting, but apparently it was a normal thing in medicine in Jesus' time. Now, Luke could have rejected Jesus, thought, yuck, pulled it off, got his clothes to wiped off, headed for the nearest bowl of water. Instead, he tapped his way around the city with the first century equivalent of a white stick. As Jesus said, and the mud plastered all over his eyes, you can imagine the comments. What are you doing? Wandering around with mud all over your face. And then the skeptic saying, he said what? And you believe him? In the Message translation, verse 11 says, I did what he said. When I washed, I saw. Trusting and obeying Jesus came before any evidence of healing. And that took faith and courage. It must have been really difficult in that interim time. Then imagine how Luke must have felt when he could first see. He was in the middle of a busy city. He could see all the hustle and bustle, the people careering around, the animals, possibly putting faces to voices that he'd known all his life. It must have been exciting, joyful, bewildering, and totally overwhelming, all at the same time. And then he had to start answering questions from the people that he saw. Some acknowledged the miracle was possible and accepted it was Luke. Others decided it had to be somebody who looked like Luke, sounded like Luke, and was wearing Luke's clothes, but it wasn't Luke. It's unlikely. But there have always been a people who will attribute what God has done to anything and anyone except God, as I'm sure many of you will have experienced. Now, the people who didn't believe Luke would have been the ones taking him to the Pharisees, and Luke's new eyesight started causing him problems. The Pharisees were highly educated religious experts with enormous power in Israel, and their whole lives revolved around keeping not just the Old Testament laws, but loads of extra man-made rules that had come on top of them. So the Sabbath started Friday sunset, finished Saturday sunset, and no work was to be done during that time. And following Old Testament teaching would have ensured that everyone, not just the wealthy, had a day of rest and space for God in their lives, giving a really good work-life balance. But religious leaders have put in huge numbers of extra laws about what counted as work on a Sabbath. And so keeping the law could make the Sabbath a burden rather than a blessing. In healing Luke, Jesus had broken at least 3 of these man-made laws. Firstly, he'd healed on the Sabbath, which was not allowed. If somebody was dying, you could stop them dying until the end of the Sabbath and then heal them, but you weren't to heal them on the Sabbath. The second was he'd use spit. And even if you got a bit of dust on your muck on your eye and you wanted to wipe it off. That was illegal on the Sabbath. It was work. And Jesus had made the mud. And that was interpreted as anything which had any movement, that could be anything like kneading bread dough, was illegal, and that included making mud. So this was in addition to the dislike and even hatred that some of the Pharisees already had of Jesus, as we've heard in previous weeks. The Pharisees asked Luke what had happened, and verse 16 says they were divided in their conclusions. Some saw Jesus had broken man-made rules, and therefore he had nothing to do with God, and it confirmed he was a really dangerous baddie. Others said he can't have healed if he wasn't from God. The ones who didn't like Jesus turned on Luke, poor man, and said, "So what do you say about Jesus? It was your eyes he healed." So Luke, who had only met Jesus once briefly, hadn't had anything to do with him, and probably had a very basic education, if any, was being asked to tell the religious elite of the day what he thought about Jesus. And he replied, "He's a prophet." Not a good answer for the anti-Jesus faction. This group decided to treat Luke's healing as a scam. They called his parents, asking them to confirm that he was their son, hoping they would deny it. They came in and said, "Yeah, he's our son, but we don't know anything about him being healed. Ask him, he's of age." And bear in mind, being of age meant you'd had your 13th birthday. So this could have been Luke, a teenager left on his own against the religious leaders, being abandoned. So why would parents do that? We find the answer in verses 22 and 23. The Jews had already decided that anyone who acknowledged Jesus was the Christ would be put out of the synagogue. It doesn't sound a lot to us, but it was a terrifying threat to Jews in Jesus' day. When John's Gospel uses the phrase the Jews in a negative sense, he always refers to the Jewish religious leaders, not the Jewish people as a whole. Being put out of the synagogue meant being banned from any place of Jewish worship. The synagogues, where people met to worship God every Sabbath, and the temple, meant they couldn't worship or offer sacrifices with their community, and sacrifices were essential to worshipping God for them. It also included being cursed by the religious leaders and being told that they had no access to God anymore. And even if they didn't believe that, there was a huge social isolation. It was a terrible threat. They became outcasts. Poor Luke. Left alone, he had to tell his story to the Pharisees again, but this time they intimidated him first. They said that they, the religious elite, knew Jesus was a sinner and therefore cut off from God, and then said, "Give glory to God," which was a phrase used in neo-cross-examination to suggest somebody was being dishonest. Until I was preparing for this talk, I hadn't realised at all what an amazing man Luke was. In verse 25, Luke sticks to his guns and says, "I don't know about Jesus being a sinner, but I do know that I was blind and now I can see." After our passage ends, Luke runs rings around the religious leaders' view of Jesus by quoting the Old Testament scriptures back at them. They were furious and threw him out of the synagogue. These Pharisees wanted their own way so much they'd become religious thugs. Chapter 12, John tells us that even members of the Jewish leadership who believed Jesus didn't dare let others know. Remember Nicodemus that we heard about weeks ago, who was so scared of his fellow members of the Jewish High Council that he came at night? These men were so confident of their human knowledge and spiritual insight that their minds were closed. They wouldn't listen to Jesus or go back and look at the Old Testament in the light of the amazing miracles he did to see if they might just have misunderstood part of it. So, in summary, we've looked at Luke, who had no expectations of Jesus before this day, but trusted him, did as he said, and was healed of his physical blindness. And later that day, later in the chapter we read, was healed of his spiritual blindness, acknowledging Jesus as God and becoming a Jesus follower. In contrast, we've looked at the Pharisees who had all the head knowledge, but were unwilling to use it to even consider Jesus' claims, despite the evidence of his actions and teaching, so they remained spiritually blind. And the ordinary people, some of them were like Luke and some like the Pharisees in their choices. So how do we apply this now? Briefly, I want to go back to the beginning of the passage and say, how do we react when bad things happen to us? Do we look for someone to blame, other people, or very often God? Or do we give situations to God and ask him to bring good out of them? It makes a huge difference to how we deal with difficult times. And if anyone doubts that, please arrange to have a chat with me about the difference it made when I was having cancer treatment throughout last year. And then back to the main part of the story. For those listening who do not know Jesus, who are you going to be like? Luke, who tested out Jesus' claims and was totally transformed? Or the Pharisees, whose pride in their own knowledge and desire to be in control prevented them from even looking at Jesus' claims? For many today, the crunch point is, I'm in charge of my life. If I let Jesus in, he could cramp my style, mess up my plans, interfere with what I want to do. Like Luke, I can testify that even if God does mess up your plans and change them, his plans are always better than ours anyway, even if, like Luke, it didn't look like it at the beginning. And let's not forget Luke's journey through the city in this. Jesus had started to do something, but there was not yet any evidence. And walking that part takes faith, and it's scary for anyone considering following Jesus. And for Christians who are entering a new phase of life, being called down a new path, or facing new difficult situations, we face the same scary challenge. We must choose, are we going to trust Jesus in this or not? The choice is ours. Do we let Jesus transform our lives, or do we stay spiritually blind and keep him out? And if anyone is in any of these situations, it's really helpful to chat to somebody. So please feel free either to contact the church office or speak to me if you know me.